Okay, hopefully we have some people on air now. Welcome to this webinar. This is webinar 2 of a series hosted by the Australasian Evaluation Society Special Interest Group on Design and Evaluation. So we'll go on to this. It's a series of seminars. The first one, which you can actually still catch online, the first one was an introductory webinar about design and evaluation more generally. I can see there's 12 people, 14 people. Welcome, everybody. The first webinar, as I say, was an introductory one about design and evaluation. And this one, this seminar today, is going to be specifically about aimed at evaluators who are working in the sort of with designers and social innovators. So we conceived 3 ways in which evaluators work with in design. The 3 ways are that evaluators can support designers in designs. And that's what the topic of this one is. The other 2 ways that designers and evaluators can work together is one, actually evaluators becoming designers, which is sort of stepping sideways into a different career pathway. And the third one, I've done this slightly out of order, is actually using the concepts of human-centered design in an evaluation process. So I'll just repeat that. There's 3 ways that we think design and evaluation go together. One is one is about evaluators working alongside social innovators, and that's what today's about. The other one is actually using the concepts of human-centered design to design a monitoring and evaluation framework or an evaluation. And the 4th way is evaluators stepping into the world of being a designer. So I'm on number 2. So what we're going to do today is I'm going to just define a few concepts first before we actually show an interview that we've pre-recorded between myself and Mark Cabana. And after that pre-recorded interview, I'll take some questions and answers. But before we dive into the interview, I just wanted to tell you a bit about Mark and also define some concepts. Okay, so this is a few concepts to talk to you about before we show the YouTube video. So we're going to be talking to Mark Cabana, who is a Canadian evaluator / designer, I guess, and he works alongside designers as an evaluator, which is the topic of this seminar. He's going to be talking about a few concepts that you may be familiar or you may not be familiar with, but for the benefit of those who aren't, I'll just go through some of them. First of all, we're talking about using design in the social innovation sector. So what do I mean by that? Well, I guess a lot of design originated from product design. So it originated from designing a car or designing the Apple mouse. We talked about that last time. So I guess when we say social innovation, we're talking about social policy, social programming. We're talking about service design, so how you might design a program to reduce child protection orders, or how you might use it to engage children at school. So it's to do the world of people, I guess. World of people. People and the world, I can see that there. So that's what we're talking about. And I guess particularly if you work in Australia and if you work in the public sector, social innovation would be about innovating around our social programming, our social policies. So Department of Human Services, Education, the departments that deal with people. So that's what we mean by social innovation. And we've been at Clear Horizon, we work a lot with the Australian Centre for Social Innovation. Check them out if you haven't already. And they sort of specialise in using design thinking in social innovation. So, and they work on the themes of disability, ageing, and child protection, to give you an idea of the sort of spaces that people work in. That's my first concept. So the second thing I want to talk about is evaluating prototypes. To talk about that, I need to guide you to look at this diagram of the double diamond, which we did discuss last time. So in a design process, this double diamond is a very, very well-known graphic. that sort of shows the process of design from research to insights and then to ideation, that's idea creation, and through to prototyping. So in particular, evaluators, developmental evaluators, get a bit stuck on how to evaluate prototypes. So a prototype is a very early idea, I guess. So there's lots of different types of prototypes, but it's an idea. You might come up with several prototypes from your ideation. They're early ideas. Sometimes they're on paper. They're just paper cutouts and ideas, and sometimes they're sort of the beginning of something that might become a pilot. But you'd start off with quite a few prototypes, and they wouldn't all continue to pilot stage. So it's an idea that's an early idea. So that's what we're going to talk about. I find it, working as a developmental evaluator, quite challenging when we get to the prototyping phase, exactly how you go about evaluating things that may disappear, change quickly, and it's a time that the designer's often asking for more help. So in the interview, I'll ask Mark, who's a bit of an expert in this area, about how to work on the prototyping stage. Scaling solutions is another concept we're going to talk about. So what do we mean by that? I guess once you've sort of, in the design process, when you've got a few prototypes and tested them, some of them may prove to be no good and we'll stop working on those, but a few of them might actually begin to have some promise. And this is where we start taking them more into the piloting stage. And I guess if a pilot has been effective, if we actually test it with more rigorous evaluation and we find that it's been effective, we might start to think about how can we scale that out. There's different types of scaling. People talk about deep scaling and wide scaling, but often it's, implementing the program in a wider context, more people, more deeply, more different sectors and so forth. And it's often quite political because there are choices about what to stop and what to continue. And it's not just simply a matter of what's working or what's not. It's also, I guess, people get behind ideas sometimes and they get enamored with them. And it's not always just about evidence as to whether they go forward. So I'm going to ask him about that too. Then there's a concept here, you probably all know what developmental evaluation is, but I'll just cover it just in case. So developmental evaluation is, I guess what we're talking about today is a type of evaluation in which the evaluator works in a space before the program has been defined. So that is in a design phase, in such as social innovation, before people have decided there is no program. Yeah, we think we're playing with ideas and we're trying to come up with solutions, and we're working in a messy space before program. It may be informing policy, or it may be informing a new program, but there is yet no program. It's also, that's the sort of most simplest way to explain it, but sometimes there are programs that we call iterative, so you never stop designing them. So they're implement design, you're constantly iterating. And I suppose in that space, a developmental evaluator would be, the life would be longer of developmental evaluation. It might go through out the entire process. So developmental evaluation differs. It's often held up against formative evaluation and summative evaluation as the third party. Summative evaluation is used to prove something. Formative is for improving an existing program. Developmental means there is no program. We haven't got to that part yet. And it was, of course, sort of put forward into the world by Michael Patton, who wrote a book on it. If you haven't read it, check it out. And also the person that I'm going to be interviewing, you're going to see the interview of shortly, Mark Cabana. He was one of Michael Patton's students, and he's worked closely with Michael Patton. So the final thing is complex social change. And so I might just slip to the next slide. Tom, thank you. So here's Mark. I've been talking about him. So I'm going to be interviewing him. I just want to tell you a little bit about him. You can see the words here. Mark's the president of a consulting company from here to there. And he was also actually, I think he was one of the founders of Tamarack Institute, now an associate. So he's an evaluator, a developmental evaluator from Canada. worked closely with Michael Patton, but he's also been very involved in the whole collective action movement. I'm not sure if you guys are familiar with that. It's quite big in Australia. The work of Kerry Graham and Collaborate for Impact has really been changing things in Australia. So there's quite a few collective impact initiatives, and they are about tackling very complex social problems using collective action, and they're trying to create systems change. And so they engaged Mark Cabana to come over and help them work on collective impact and how you evaluate it. So that was the link. And so he came to Australia to present a series of masterclasses on how to evaluate social complex social change. And what they were talking about complex social change was sort of working not so much at the program level or the policy level, but at the systems level. So and that was through the collective impact. I think he might have even come up with the term collective impact. He's very associated with collective impact movement, but at the same time, he's used to evaluating messy things, so he's very relevant for us, very relevant person to talk to. So Mark was doing this tour, a series of masterclasses around Australia, and I grabbed him and interviewed him for us. And we will now play that interview. And I hope that you enjoy this interview. It lasts for 14 minutes. And at the end of it, I'm really happy to answer any questions that you might have, but we'll ask you to type them. So if you want to make a note of any questions as we go through. And this is actually going to stay on YouTube. So if you want to watch it again later, you'll be able to do that. So we might move on and play that now. Hope you enjoy. Hello Mark, how are you?
Very good.
Thanks so much for giving us your time today. We really appreciate it. We know you've been busy running workshops around the place and on how to evaluate complex community change. So given that you've been talking about that, our first question today is, so what sort of advice would you give an evaluator who's working with social innovators for the first time?
It's a good question. The advice is actually simple: to appreciate how a social innovator operates, in part because the way social innovators operate it's often challenging for a more conventional approach to evaluation, and I think we can more than handle it, but we should pay attention to these characteristics. And the first one is, a lot of social innovators have a very general sense of direction, the kind of outcomes they want to achieve, and have pretty good hunches or confidence in their opening moves about how they want to tackle those issues. But often they don't know more than that. Many of them truly need to think with their hands. So they're not really planning oriented, they learn by doing. Think with their hands. And so that's a challenge for us, because often we would like the intervention to sit down with them and describe the intervention as fully as we can. So that's number one, and we're going to come back to that. So many of them do not know more than their opening moves and their end game. Number two, lots of them are actually not very data oriented, right? They have hunches, they are very good at rapid cognition, they see things quickly, they internalize things quickly, and they move quickly. And part of what evaluation does is to ask people to slow down a bit and pay attention to data and to think about what it means and appreciate that there's different ways of understanding things. And so that there's a bit of a tension there. The third one is, the interventions that social innovators work on often evolve and change quite quickly. Right. And we often like to spend a little bit of upfront time designing an evaluation design, and we begin to like it a little bit, but those designs have a rapid half-life. They have what's in business called strategic decay. So we really have to co-evolve our evaluation designs to keep pace, as fast or as slow as the social innovator is going.
Excellent, thank you very much. Okay, on to the second question. Yeah, one particular thing that we're interested in is, in terms of the innovation cycle, is that middle bit where the prototyping occurs, and especially the early moving into prototypes, because that can be a very challenging place for
evaluators to work particularly messy. So how can the evaluator work in that space?
Yep. Yeah, prototyping is becoming quite big, isn't it? For lots of different reasons, we're seeing it pop up everywhere. The way I think about it or approach it is that prototypes are really small bets. Innovators create these prototypes, they physical manifestations of ideas in order to be clear about their own thinking and to use their hands and to evoke a response. And so those are small bets. And evaluation, another way of thinking about it, is reality testing. How do innovators help social innovators test those small bets? And the challenge is we don't have a long time to create designs, and we have even less time than they have to create the design. So we actually have to do really good work in real-time feedback on these quickly moving small bets that often turn into big bets over time, but not yet. So the challenge for us is we can add value here with asking them to be clear about the questions they would like to explore with prototypes. Many innovators don't know. They just want to know, does it work?
Yeah.
Well, evaluators are good at crafting questions about what do you mean by works. Many social innovators are not clear about what a measurement or an indicator looks like when you have a very small bet. Well, we have experience in that to say, would success look and feel like this? And finally, there's so many different kinds of prototypes that we have to be very accomplished in thinking about different ways of gathering and analyzing feedback to give them answers to their questions. And so evaluators have a lot of experience in that area, so they can weave together lots of different techniques to provide this real-time feedback. So in many ways, prototyping looks like sort of a low stake intervention. It is quite high stake, and it requires us to sharpen our skills in a way that maybe we haven't been tested before.
And quickly, I guess.
Yes, and quickly.
Yeah. Okay, on to the next question. So my third question is, it's to do with, I'd be interested to know your thoughts on the sort of bit further on in the social innovation processes when you get to scaling. I'd be really interested to know how you see evaluators working at the scaling side of things and how we should conceptualize it.
I agree that scaling, there's lots of dimensions to scaling. There is a political dimension, and the way that, but I think politics plays out in a couple of different ways. So let's define scaling a little bit. For many years, it's a very broad term, and I don't know how it's used in Australia, but in more recently in Canada, someone has written some papers that have helped us frame it slightly better than we've framed it before. And there's three kinds of scaling, or three dimensions of scaling. The first one is scaling out. And scaling out is where you take an idea, you've got a practice that you've tested and piloted, and it seems worthy of scaling. And what you try and do is replicate it in other contexts. Whether that's the full-fledged copy of the original practice, or we're replicating principles and general patterns of behavior, that's a very good question. But scaling out is the most obvious kind of scaling. We also know that scaling up is important, and scaling up is based on the idea that sometimes these pilots are developed in very unique incubator type contexts where it's almost anything is possible. But when you try and mainstream them, they run across policies, resource constraints, regulations, any number of things that make it very hard to thrive outside of that incubator status. So scaling up is actually changing rules, regulations, resource flows, and cultures to make the innovation live. And so sometimes you need that. The third one is scaling deep. And scaling deep is a little bit different than scaling out and scaling up, in the sense that what it says is, how do you get the very idea behind an innovation, the commitment to it, in the water supply, in the culture, in the identity of a system. And we're using system broadly, it may not just mean a government system. So we may find that a program that is really useful in having home visiting by nurses, we've scaled it out and we've scaled it up, but we're worried that the commitment to that idea may not transcend a political cycle. So scaling deep is, how do you get cross-party buy-in, how do you get constituencies in different systems like the nursing system, the social work system, really finding that idea to be an integral part of their identity.
It's embedding it.
It's really embedding it, the very idea of it, maybe not even necessarily the practice. So all of those three have political dimensions when you replicate out. the politics of trying to bring innovation from one context into another. There are politics in there, different values and interests and positions. People might find that disruptive. Scaling up, it's political in the sense that it might require policy change, resource flow changes, regulation changes. And even if those regulations are small ones, I don't know if you have this experience in Australia, but there's lots of micro threads that keep current practices in place.
Yeah.
By themselves, they're not magic, but a million little micro threads and regulations are enough to hold something in place. And of course, getting something into the water supply, the identity as a political priority or a cultural, mainstreaming culturally also has aspects of being political. So the scaling for innovators says take account of all those three, and for the evaluator, one has to pay attention to those dimensions of scaling, the political dimensions of all three.
And whether they've worked, I guess. Yeah.
And whether they've not, or whether you're feeling resistance, why can't we scale it? Well, there might be a strong political dimension to that.
Excellent. Thank
Yeah.
you very much. So I've got a bit of a cheeky question now. So we were wondering what you think of the idea that developmental evaluation is simply an introspective indulgence for evaluator and a bit meaningless for people outside the evaluation world.
Yeah, well, it is exciting for many evaluators to open up this box called developmental evaluation and play around with its ideas and some of the practices. I don't think it's an indulgence. A couple things that, for me, I find highly relevant in this day and age when we're trying to solve tough problems. The first one is developmental evaluation is a niche type of evaluation that's got a very particular purpose. Traditional and other types of evaluation are often about improving and making better existing practices or judging merit or worth of existing practices. But we really need evaluative thinking in the process of crafting and creating new things, the act of creation. And so that's a strong niche, and we're all evaluative thinkers, but how can evaluators bring good questions and real-time feedback and good sense-making processes to social innovators? And that's a very special niche. So social innovators are often creative thinkers, and evaluation is a critical act. How do you know what you think you know? Are there other ways of looking at that? And so in some ways, developmental evaluation is the sweet spot between those two things. And it says to the innovators, could you be the creative you? Be who you are, but maybe slow down sometimes and think about data and consider different ways of understanding this and be open to the possibility that your good hunch is just a hunch and it hasn't turned out. And it says to the evaluators, how do you support the social innovators, run alongside them without short-circuiting their efforts by being overly critical, because the act of creation requires some freedom, requires some emergence. So I think we can all do that. I don't think developmental evaluation is counterintuitive, but I do think it's countercultural to the way that social innovators and evaluators have often worked in the past. Not everywhere, but it's worthy of naming it and trying to get better at it.
Thank you. Final question. Thanks so much for your time. So I just thought we'd summarise by maybe you giving us some of your top tips for evaluators working on programs that seek to bring about complex social change.
Well, I'm happy to share three top things that I find important, but I also would encourage anyone who's interested in developmental evaluation to go to betterevaluation.org.
Yeah.
Or to read some books by Michael Quinn Patton and others, because there's so much good stuff on here now. So my sharing of the tips are just things that are maybe my top reminders or tips for Mark Ravage. The first one is to find the right balance of helping innovators conceptualize their intervention, their ideas, their theories of change, in a way that encourages them to go as far as they can at the moment, but not to force them to go farther than they are ready, simply because we're used to getting, relatively well laid out plans and intentions. And it's a very tricky space, and you know it when you're in it, whether you're pushing too much, but we should nudge them as far as they can be nudged. And rather than an intervention that's framed in a way that we would think is incomplete, if we were being more conventional, we might think the evaluation glass is half full. But in some ways, in developmental situations and social innovation, that's simply the baseline. That's simply where they're beginning. and you can track the evolution of their thinking over time. So be prepared to go as far as you can and not push any farther, but allow the rest of the intervention to emerge as people try new things. So that would be number one. That's what I tell myself, I remind myself quite often. Number two is to really recognize that the probabilities that our evaluative feedback will be dramatically improved if we can get innovators truly hungry for feedback. And you know how tricky that is for anyone to do it, and it's particularly important for innovators who are curious, but they're fast moving, and they'll unfold that, they'll play with that curiosity in real time, but we can help them do it better. So asking them, what are your questions? How will you know that it's successful? How would you like your feedback? When do you make decisions and how? And really try and get into their head, much like a design orientation encourages us to do, and I know that's getting really big in Australia. I fully support it. Think like a designer and design around the innovator. We need them to be hungry and curious. So everything depends on that. The third one, and this one again is not so much counterintuitive, but it is countercultural. Let's create agile designs. Innovators often start with small bets and are quite rapid in iterating those bets and evolving. Our designs should co-evolve as fast or as slowly as their questions and their interventions. So let's not love our original designs. Let's consider them opening moves, just as the social innovators consider them opening moves. And when the questions change, so too should our evaluation designs.
And they have half-lives, like you said.
They have, their half-life is as big or as small, as fast or as slow as the innovator. So our work has to be tightly calibrated to theirs.
Well, that was fantastic, and that is the end of all my questions. Well, thanks so much for that, Mark. That's been really illuminating, and I'm sure our audience will find it interesting too. So thanks so much.
They were great questions, and thanks for having me in Australia. Enjoyed every bit.
And I hope you have a safe trip back to Canada. Thank you.
There, managed to stop it from running again. I'm sure you wanted to listen to it all over again. So what we're going to do now is give you an opportunity to ask some questions. Just ignore the screen for a few minutes as we get this right. So on your screen, hopefully you can see a box on the left-hand side, and the idea is that you could type some questions in about that. And I will try and answer them as best I can. And if we have questions that I can't answer, then Mark, we'll get in touch with Mark and we'll hassle him and we'll get his answers. So any comments or questions, please start typing. Okay, so somebody's asked here, Claire has asked, I'm finding a client changes their questions every week. Is this normal? And we might need to know a little bit about what your client is doing. My experience of working as a developmental evaluator with a design working on a design at the moment, there's a lot of change every week. I'm not sure exactly if it's the questions that change every week, but the design is moving very fast, and yet we still don't really have a prototype to evaluate. So that's a sort of interesting space to get in. Oh, they're trialing a service and design improvement. It can change really fast. It is the speed of the way designers work that I think challenges us evaluators. As Mark said, they move so fast from hunches, trying to think about ideas, and in terms of ideation, it's a very fast process. And I guess one of the main differences for us is that we're used to having more time and working more slowly and being more structured. Somewhere between the two is something really great. But yes, I guess it probably is normal, to answer your question. Oh, John, hello. John Owen. How do you manage the need to fulfill? Any more questions? Can't see any more coming along. Oh, they're all thinking. Yeah. Okay. It's actually been fascinating, some of the work I've been doing lately in design, working in a design, and I'm learning so much about working with designers. And I guess it's quite challenging working with designers in the sense that you have to be very agile. I'm thinking the word agile applies to evaluators, and the thing that is most useful is probably just using evaluative thinking and challenging assumptions and using theory of change. Okay, so I've got another question here. How rigorously to approach theory of change with innovators? Yeah, that's a good question. I think we can be quite rigorous, actually. I think this is where, but just rigorous in the sense that maybe detail's a better word. I think you can go into a fairly detailed theory of change scenario, but what you have to remember is, as Mark Cabana says, don't get attached to it, because it's only at a point in time, because it may be thrown out or things may change quite rapidly. And that if you're going to use theory of change, you're going to have to create a lot of versions of it. So don't overinvest in making it too perfect. But certainly you do need to get into the details, because they use the detailed theory of change to identify areas to sort of explore, if you like, opportunity areas to sort of do some design on. So detail is needed, without a doubt. So don't be frightened of detail, but don't get too attached. I hope that answers your question. So Vanessa, I've got a question from Vanessa. Hello, Vanessa. Okay, does a prototype have to be something physical, or can it be an idea only? Oh no, it's definitely can be an idea. I guess it begins as an idea, but then it's sort of developed. So the most early prototype is a paper prototype. So it becomes, that could be almost like a theory of change diagram of that particular prototype. So you map out how it might be and you look at it, and then I guess you get ready to sort of like test it. If you're using human-centered design though, you would then begin to test that idea with the users, because that's how it works in user-centered design. You generate the ideas together and try them out. But I guess conceptual, yeah, it starts like an idea and becomes more physical. They like to make it physical. So things like mapping it out in paper, or creating a version of modeling it somehow with straw sticks or on a wall, or however you can test it, making it real enough to test, if that makes sense. I'm not a designer though. I'm not, like you all, I'm learning. Maybe some of you are designers, then you better speak up and answer the question. Okay, we've only got 6 people on the line now, so some people have left. Oh no, 23. Sorry, I'm looking in the wrong place. I have 22 people on the line. So any more questions? So, yeah. Did you like what Mark said at the end, the 3 things to talk to? 3 main tips. Was the first one was about theory of change testing. I completely agree that we have a lot to offer in the theory of change in the early stages, which is nice, because honestly it feels like there is nothing we can do early on in a design. I feel a bit like a spare part sometimes, but that theory of change thinking and working on the assumptions and clarifying them seems to be a really useful thing to do. So I reckon that's a really good one. Yeah, thinking like a designer. Yes. What Mark was saying when he said think like a designer is don't get too attached to your designs. I suppose the whole idea of a prototype is that but some of them die, they don't all keep going. So you might do 20 or 30 prototypes and only one might survive and make it. So the idea is a bit like that. When you're working with designers, you've got to let go of, you might have developed a lovely little M&E framework or an evaluation plan to fit around a prototype. By the time you've developed it, they've abandoned it. So this is the idea of don't get too attached, you've got to move fairly quickly when the ideas start coming out and test them and use it evaluative thinking to sort of apply some rigor to it. Okay. All right. So hello John, another question from John Owen. The collective impact community in the literature does not seem to provide advice about how to evaluate or even worry about the ultimate impact. Is this your experience? Not quite. So collective impact, they have this idea of a shared measurement framework. and they all join together to measure that, and they definitely do measure the impact. I guess there's nothing that special about measuring the impact at the end. The things we've learned about summative evaluation and impact management become play out. So the designers I'm working with, when they finally get to a solution that they think has passed all the tests and has really got a lot of promise, and they begin to pilot it at scale, they use things like randomized control trials, and they go all the way. They go into the terrain that we're probably more familiar with in a way. They go into the summative evaluation methods. They use, interrupted time series design and quasi-experimental designs, and they look at the social return on investment and things like that. So it sort of moves into an area that I guess I know. I suppose that the bit that's different is earlier on, when we're near the impact. So how do you operate in that space? But they do definitely get into the impact end. It's just more when the ideas are more developed, when you get into piloting, which is further on at the end of that double diamond design. It's right to the pointy end of the second diamond. Yeah, sorry about my Dropbox messages that keep popping up. We're all learning how to do this stuff online. Next time will be even better, won't we, Tom? Tom's sitting here and we're doing this together. Okay, actually, Damien, thank you, has contributed the guide for collective impact, and that talks about the shared measurement framework. Okay, I've got another question from Claire here. Claire says, I find there's a tension in designers wanting us to collect information evidence, e.g. online survey with the consumers, and then moving on into focus even before you're finishing designing the survey. So maybe we can only really offer the brainstorming of the theory of change. Yeah, well, the theory of change is the bit that I have had most success with, I think, so far. We've really and everybody's really appreciated it. So it's definitely a bit of a winner. The other thing is, Claire, it's really seems to be helpful to convene reflection exercises. Yeah, and to just slow people down and say, let's reflect on what we've learned and what have we got here, and follow a sort of structured reflection, because designers often go so fast that they don't do that properly. So that's another thing that works really well, collecting data quickly in whatever way you can. I have managed to do surveys and things, but they have to be done fairly quickly. Yeah. Oh, hello, Helen Moriarty. And Vanessa, I've got another question from Vanessa. Thanks, Tom. Can you share some of your experience using this approach within an organisation that's risk averse? Well, I mean, like, risk averse, that's such a challenging question. I mean, if they're doing design stuff and playing around, that's the bit that's risky. It's not the evaluation so much that's risky, it's the design stuff. So if they're throwing themselves out there and prototyping and trying new things out and stepping into uncharted territories, then they're already acting in a less conservative manner. They're already embracing the risk. In fact, evaluation's the bit that they're probably most comfortable with, in my experience. They love the evaluation side of it, they want more of it, and that's the bit they know, and it's the design bit that scares people. So I don't know, I think evaluation can provide comfort to those frightened by the risk of design. But the only thing is to balance that need for accountability with actual learning. Okay, now this is the last question I'm going to answer, because we're running out of time, so I'm just going to take this question from Helen. Hello, Helen. So Helen asks, working in the before program space implies a potentially open-ended process in terms of the time it could take. Most design processes are finite timeframes. Are there any opportunities in the Australian context that invest in longer, larger, open-ended processes, and in which sectors? Yeah, so Helen, I know that you work in international development, and the stuff that we're talking about is not from international development, and it has a lot more time. And it is being given time, and social innovation is not time-bound in quite the same way as the sort of DFAT designs or the international development designs that you and I have worked on in the past, that are sort of very, very time-bound with a specific thing. This is a different world. It's almost like doing policy research, I suppose. yeah, and it's often being funded by philanthropists with different funding imperatives, maybe more not looser isn't the right way, freer, less tied by specific timeframes. So I would say, yeah, you do need time for this stuff, but sometimes the designs are time bound, and they have ways of getting stuff happening quickly. They do sprints where everybody piles in, all hands in, and we sort of do intensive work, and then we plan it around getting stuff done. Designers are very good at getting stuff done. I think that evaluators could learn a lot from them. They get lots of stuff done in a short period of time. But I guess, yeah, so the sectors it's happening in Australia, in the domestic sector. It's happening, it's funded by philanthropy, but there are government departments so are setting up user-centered design units, quite a few federal government departments. It's rumblings in Victoria going on. It's all over the place. In international development, this thinking is definitely happening, but I think it's happening within what we call facilities, within these very large contracted out programs that then have the space inside them to do the design thinking. It's sort of not done in a 3-month mission. I hope that answers your question. I think that's it. So I'd just like to say thanks for bearing with us, and we promise to get better at this technology stuff each time we do this. We're all learning how to do this online, and any suggestions you've got for us, we really welcome. We have the next webinar, which will be even better than this one, and that one's on our sort of next topic. It's about using human-centered design in evaluation. So it's sort of using the idea of human-centered design to make a better monitoring and evaluation framework, or make a better evaluation. So it's a slightly different orientation. And we also have been lucky enough to be accepted to run a pre-conference workshop at the conference in Canberra, which is in September, and Chris Vanstone, who is the chief innovator from Taxi, is going to run that with me. So that is going to be an introduction to human-centered design live in Canberra, if you want to come along to that. Clear Horizon also has a 2-day one that Chris is helping us with in November as well. And of course, join our LinkedIn group and stay updated. Is there anything else that we need to say, Tom? Tom's sitting next to me here. So thank you very much for your time. I hope this has been useful. We're really open to feedback on how to make things run better and do it via the AES Design and Evaluation SIG. No, the LinkedIn group. Tom's telling me. Yeah. Sorry. Please give us your feedback via the LinkedIn group. Have a lovely day. Thank you for joining me, and goodbye.
Thanks.